Hello everyone, and this is BioPhoenix here, and today we're doing yet another random ass anime review. And the one I chose today happens to be 8-Man After, which is a pretty interesting one for the fact that this character is actually very old. So the original show came out in 1963, so yeah, it's that old, so meaning that there's no color in it. But just like a lot of other shows that came out around that time, such as Astro Boy, it actually was very influential. Unfortunately, I never got around to watching it yet, but it is something I might have to check out at some point, but I figured I'd mention it that it is a pretty historical anime piece. But the one we're taking a look at today is 8-Man After, which is an OVA that came out in 1993. And there is only 4 episodes. And yes, with having the word after in the name, it is kinda like a sequel, but the good thing is that it's a pretty self-contained story on its own merits. And speaking of that, let's get talking about it. So our main character in this is named Detective Hazama, and his mission is to retrieve some stolen machinery parts. So while trying to do that, he ends up meeting this one character named Sachiko, and Sachiko was actually the original love interest from the original 8-Man. So after when he asks her a bunch of questions, she ends up becoming more involved with the case. And many events later, it turns out that there's another cyborg out there who's actually trying to kill her. And of course, Hazama witnesses it and actually tries to save her. But while he does this, he ends up getting himself really badly injured to the point where he needs his body to be rebuilt. And that's where he becomes the new 8-Man. So what exactly is 8-Man? Well, he's an android that looks very similar to a superhero, and he happens to have really high speeds. In fact, he can move so fast that sometimes when he runs past certain people, they actually get like some of their flesh torn off, which is pretty insane. Also, he's overall a lot stronger for that he can actually crush things with his fists. And another thing too is that he can actually change between the two forms of being 8-Man and Hazama at any time. So yeah, that power right there kinda reminds me of something from like the Terminator films. And speaking of action films at that time period, I do find that this story overall is very similar to RoboCop. So after he becomes 8-Man, he actually rescues Sachiko again for that she ends up being attacked by another group of cyborgs. So now Hazama is more motivated than ever to try and like do the case, and he also vows revenge on those that ruined him and his life. And that sums up the basics of what you need to know on this one. So for an OVA that's based after such an old property, it is pretty much what you would expect. A pretty simple story with a lot of action, and also does have some characterization. For that you actually do get some motivation for the main characters, and even the villains too. So now, let's get moving on to the other things, like the animation. And the animation in this one, I do think is actually pretty good. So the flow of movement is consistent and well done, and also all like the designs are cool. In fact, I really do like 8-Man's design. It's pretty simplistic, but it looks nice. Like this is kind of how I would imagine like such an old classic character getting revived into the 90s would look like. Also, some of the backgrounds look pretty cool as well, and there's also quite a bit of blood and gore in this one, although not an over amount of excessiveness to the point of Genocyber, but you know, quite a bit. But the gore effects do look pretty cool though. But I have to say that the close-ups on like the machinery parts is definitely really awesome looking. I especially like the part where you actually get to see 8-Man in his like skeletal form. That looks awesome. But if there's anything I had to be critical on with the animation though, would have to be that there are certain spots in it where I do feel that the colors can be a little bit too washed out. But I'm not entirely sure if that's just how it was, or if it was just the version I watched, because I will say, the version of this that I watched was only in like 480p, so it might have been that too. But I don't know, there were some spots where I did notice where it did look a lot better than others. But yeah, other than that one thing though, I would say that everything else about this is really damn good looking for a 93 OVA. And now, as for the show's music, the music in this one, I think is decent, but it's nothing super memorable though, at least to me. Like, the music fits the setting for that, you know, it fits like a cyberpunk world, and also has some like urban stuff, which is kinda interesting. So yeah, it's one of those OSTs where it's fitting for what it is, but it's nothing that I found to be like super memorable to the point where I really feel like I need to listen to these again. So unfortunately, it's not like the Ariel OVA, where that one had some great music that I totally would listen to again. But if there is one good thing that I can say about the music, is that I do find that the ending themes are pretty cool, but I especially really do like the one at the final episode. And now, as for the voice acting in this one, Now, for those of you that don't know, usually I do like to review, like, the English dub versions just because of the fact that, it actually gives me more to talk about, and, sometimes it's also funny to talk about, like, the bad voice acting, but also it's good to talk about the good ones, too. But just for this review, I just watched the Japanese version, mainly because I've never seen the Japanese version before, because the first time I watched this anime was with the English one, and I don't really remember it being, like, good or bad, but then again, I kind of wasn't really, like, focusing on that too much, but I can tell you a little bit of a rundown on the cast. So you have Steve Bolin, Art White Chamberlain, you got Dan Warren, which is pretty cool. And then there's Jeff Winkless, Kirk Thornton, Michael McConaughey, Michael Reynolds, and then there's also Richard Consino, just to name a few. So it does have a pretty cool cast of voice actors, but the thing is, I can't tell you if it's really good or bad or not though, because like I said, it has been a while. And I didn't recognize any of the Japanese voice actors by name, so I can't really say much on there. And alright, so now, as for my overall thoughts on 8 Man After, is that I found this to be a really good OVA series. Yeah, not gonna lie. I really do think it's good, and I had a lot of fun with it. So yes, like I said before, the story is pretty simplistic, and yeah, it definitely does remind me of other things, but the thing is though, a lot of this stuff from the original series though actually came before a lot of those. Which is why I would consider the original series and the property itself to be very influential. But this one though, does all that, but does it with 90s style, which I really like. So the action scenes I found to be really fun, and like I said about the characters, I thought they actually had some pretty good motivation and backstory that was actually told pretty well for 4 episodes. And I actually felt like I was invested in these characters, which was actually kinda nice. Of course, there's a couple other, characters and, other stuff I didn't want to, go too much into, though, because I do think it is at least worth seeing for yourself, even though a lot of that stuff is, yeah, pretty predictable, but I do think that it is at least worth seeing it through, just for the fun ride of it. So if you do like the sort of dark and gritty, cyberpunk type of animes, I think this is a really good one. Although, I don't know if I'd say it's as good as Cyber City Odio or, Wicked City or anything like that, but I do think that it is still a really solid one that is really enjoyable. And for only being 4 episodes long, I can definitely recommend it too, for that it's at least not a huge time investment, but I still found it to be very entertaining overall. Now, even though this property is very old and, of course, like I said, very influential, it is a little unfortunate that there really hasn't been that much, adaptations of it. For an example, the only thing they ever did with the series after 8 Man After, okay, wow, that sounds weird together, is that there was a manga series called 8 Man Infinite. And as far as I know, I don't think there has been any plans to try to make it into an anime or anything. But I suppose I should also mention that before 8 Man After, there was also 2 live-action films. One of them a TV film, the other one a full-fledged live-action movie. And the final thing here that I'll mention, and this was actually how I discovered this little series, was actually from the video game on the Neo Geo from SNK called 8 Man, which is a side-scrolling action game mostly focused around speed. And I thought it was a really good game with some really awesome graphics for Neo Geo standards. But yeah, that's all I have to say on this one. So yeah, 8 Man After definitely does get my approval, and as much as I do like the series, I always felt compared to the other series that have also been around forever, being Astro Boy and Speed Racer, I feel 8 Man doesn't really get talked about nearly as much. I find it to be a little bit on the overlooked side.